Hello, you wonderful people. Obviously, I brought this up at the end of the previous recordings, but if you're unaware, because these recordings actually went on a lot longer than I thought they were, I decided not to upload them in the massive bulk they would have been. So I am breaking these recordings up into multiple parts. So this is the continuation. I'll probably be using the same intro for multiple parts, you know, just probably make it a little easier on myself, because once again, I'm in the process of editing everything right now, and everything looks a little lengthy. So once again, that's kind of neither here nor there. Kind of is, but it kind of isn't. Point is, this is the continuation of where the previous part left off. If you have missed the previous parts, parts, once again, depending on what part this is in particular watching, I'll include links in the description down below to all the previous trails of discussion videos. So hope you enjoy. And speaking of Zeno and, well, Leonidas, but Zio and Leo, I thought was kind of a neat thing about them is you meet them, you see them twice in Code Steel 1, because obviously, like when Duke Cayenne shows up to Legrand when you're in Legrand for your field study, he brings them along, but obviously you don't know who they are at the time. But then it comes out at the end because like Fee's like, oh, that's Zeno and Leo, part of Zephyr and everything, and obviously like they're more prominent in 2, so you finally get to meet them, their personalities and stuff like that. But like when you're in the Pentagram, they're asking you all those questions like, so have you gotten close to Fee? They have their conversations with Rain about everything, and then immediately like, so back to what we were saying, are you sure you're not anything to Fee? And it's just like, it's like they're very like overprotective parents, you know. It's I think that was just kind of a neat thing. I mean, obviously, like this is also a big like moment for Ouroboros, because you get to meet some of his other members. Obviously, Duvalier is not a numbered member, but obviously she's associated because she is tied to, she's not an enforcer, but she's tied to them because her master is one of the Anguisses. So but the fact is, obviously, Phantom Thief B makes more of a prominent role. You see him pop in from time to time. And I love that him and Oliver have this whole thing, because they're rivals when it comes to beauty. Like, personality-wise, like, they gel well together. It's a whole thing. But I even love, and it's actually because they make a point of this when Reen is rescuing Alphen from the Pentagram, like, you know, because they're like, oh, Reen, how dare you dash off with the princess? But she's like, oh, I'm the one that's kind of dashing off of him. And you're like, oh, and even him, Phantom Thief B, you know, Blue Blanc kind of referencing the fact is that Alphen is kind of actually taking after her brother a little bit, because obviously that's his rival and everything. So I love that. And even Reen being like, why are these two getting along so well? This is such a weird situation. That's honestly one of my favorite moments in the game, just like that whole thing. Just because, for one, it's like it's an opportunity to sit there and talk to the bad guys. You talk to Lino and Zio, Scarlet, Vulcan, Blue Blanc. McBurn is always the really interesting one. Duvalier and Altina. But because I love that whole aspect of, because that McBurn thing kind of comes out of nowhere. Because the first time you clash with McBurn, he's like, hey, are you mixed? And Reen's like, what? He's like, well, if you don't know, you don't know. But then the whole thing of kind of understanding, like, it's your first instances of it. Because even where we are in the story, in 3, we get hints and stuff about Reen's whole situation, where his overpower comes from. You find out bits and pieces about just like that heartbeat sound every time, like, and he clenches his chest. We know what that is now to a certain extent. We don't fully know why. Once again, probably answers in 4, but like how he got the way he is, like it's still, because all McBurn says is he doesn't know how, but some way like Reen got mixed with whatever that is. And he's like, so that's what it looks like with you, like, because Reen's situation is a little bit different from McBurn's, but it's similar because Reen's only a fraction of what McBurn is, and it's like, so how much of you is that? He's like, oh, me, all of me is, you know, what he is, you know. I also love that out of any, and they make point of this in the future games, but it's like that basically every enforcer in Ouroboros is lazy, and I feel like the laziest one is definitely McBurn. He only really comes out like when he feels like, oh, there's someone here that's really worth a challenge. Okay, you know, because especially when you run into him in the Infernal Castle, he's like, oh my god, you guys put up way better of a fight. I guess I don't have to hold back, and he goes all out until like he ends up going up against the Radiant Blade Master. Because I don't think I don't think he uses it in 3, you know, spoilers, but I don't think he uses it in 3 at all. That sword he pulls out when he's like, sometimes how it looks actually changes. It's actually something from a different plane of existence that he's bringing. I'm like, this is crazy. I mean, he's legit, and they still make a whole point of like him still not knowing which between him and the Steel Maiden is stronger. And it's like, because even they're like, yeah, because even Ring makes a point of it in 3, I think, where it's like, or maybe someone else does, where it's like, yeah, he's strong, but the Steel Maiden almost feels inhuman, which says a lot considering what the fuck McBurn is. Like, he seems the most inhuman amongst Ouroboros', at least members, at least we know of. Because I think there's others you probably meet through the other games. It's actually kind of interesting because they bring this up in 3, but I think if you probably play the Trails to Zero or Trails to Azure games, you'll probably know this. But like when you run into Duvali, I think it's when you're going to arrest Eustace's dad. She, like the titling for her profile in that particular fight, it's like she seems a bit tired. It's because you end up finding out in 3 that she basically was fighting Lloyd and them in 2, and like she had to quickly go from Crossbell to back to Erebonia, and so she was exhausted. Like she had literally just fought Lloyd and them, and then she came back because of Ouroboros and everything, and had to like fight you as well. So that's why you're able to kind of win, because she was in a weakened state. She was exhausted, you know. So I thought that was such an interesting little detail. Like I said, they reference it in 3, but that's why. It's because she was fighting Lloyd, Randy, and all of them, you know, during, I'm assuming because of the timing, I would assume that's Azure, Trails to Azure, that being the second game, because I'm sure the second game takes place after the whole Azure, because obviously the code and the whole, once again, I don't know the ins and outs of the game. I only know about it just because of obviously 3 references a lot of stuff from 2, and because a lot of stuff is coinciding, because you don't get to see, only time you're able to see what happens in those in Crossbell is if you play the Crossbell games, Trails to Zero as well as Trails to Azure. But regardless, huge tangents and all of that. I think I might have I've talked about this before, how like each of the games kind of gets more and more depressing. I feel like because there's a lot more death and stuff in 2, because obviously stuff goes down in 1, but because obviously, well, you can make the argument, because like let's not forget the whole Guerrilla Fortress being attacked by the Ion happens in 1, but obviously you don't actually get the like face to face get to see the aftermath until 2, because that's, you know, Guerrilla Fortress is where you go to the proving grounds in 2, and you see Guerrilla Fortress yourself. But the fact of the matter is, like, there's a lot of death. Obviously what happens to Otto and Celtic, because that's actually tied to one of Machias's bonding events. It might actually be his final bonding event in the game, I think, because there's some of those bonding events set up like being able to unlock everyone's special that final scene you get with everybody when you get super close to everybody, like that. Like there's the one in Berea Heart, like doing all those gets, you know, because obviously you can do them if you have it set that you can do all bonding events. You can basically in one playthrough unlock everybody's in that moment, regardless tangents and all that. But Machias is him going to the bridge, because I think he said that Gaius taught him a tradition in Nord of how to pay respect to the dead. So he threw like flowers over a bridge because he wanted to pay respect to both Otto, the manager from Celtic, as well as his cousin, you know, who he referred to as Sis, kind of, you know, doing something ceremonial for them. I thought was kind of really sweet. There's a whole situation with Eustace, you know, once again, the whole complicated nature of just him trying to, well, for one, having to arrest his own dad, fighting his own brother, which is kind of interesting that it only happens the one time you get to fight him, and obviously, like, Rufus kicks your ass super easily, you know. It's a whole point to, like, try and, like, I think do a certain amount of damage to him before like a certain amount of turns, because obviously it's one of those fights of if you don't do it before a certain time, he just wipes you out with his S-Craft. I mean, doesn't need to. He could easily just kill you any other way, but the S-Craft is like the full-blown end of the battle type of thing. I think that's kind of an interesting thing they made more of a point of in 2, because in 1, there's a few exceptions. I want to say Sarah's like the only exception I can think of. Like, there's one time, I think it's Machias, Reen, and Eustace, when like they were still butting heads, you fight Sarah, she wipes the floor with you. I think that's the only fight you can't forget about Victor as well. So there's only like 2 fights in 1 that you can't win. There's a handful in 2 that you can't win, but there's a special bonuses for, you know, you get more AP if you damage him to a certain point. Like when you fight Zeno and Leo the first time, you can't beat, well, you might be able to beat them. I can't remember. I think yes, you have to beat them, right? I think you have to beat them within a certain amount of turns, is kind of, or rather get their HP to a certain point within like 40 turns or something like that. Same thing for McBurn and Duvalier. You have to actually beat Duvalier to get the extra AP, which that irritates her even more of like, maybe I shouldn't have been holding back because they beat me, and it infuriates her that these punks shouldn't have been able to beat me, you know? But there's like a couple instances of that throughout the game. Obviously, like a lot of times you go up against Crow throughout the game, like, because like obviously when you're facing off against him in your mirror, he wipes the floor with you as well. I did like the reveal about the fact is that he's kind of like, that it's like Reem pieces it together. It's like, you're the one that told Toval where I was. And he was like, Toval's like, oh yeah, that voice does sound familiar. He's like, probably the reason why. I was like, and at the time I was like, but how would he know what Crow sounded like? How did he? And it's like, all right, because he was there at the festival at the end of 1, so you know, during your performance, he's like, that's most likely where I heard Crow's voice at. But circling back to it, uses, like I said, having to deal with a lot. It's kind of the point I had before I went on a tangent and stuff like that. But the fact is that he felt so bad because he thought, like, after what his father did, he thought the people of Celtic would be mad at him. But for him, it's like, no, the people of Celtic are like, your actions are your own. They're not going to hold your father's actions against you because he hadn't done anything to the people of Celtic. So that's even more so why he felt even more motivated, because as an Alberea, it's his duty to stop his father's madness. And multiple times I thought it was kind of an interesting thing because he is in a very unique position compared to everyone else, you know, in Class 7, because he's the only member of Class 7 that's from one of, like, he's not the only noble, but he's the only one from one of the 4 great houses, even being considered, you know, because obviously it goes back and forth, because it's more so Cayenne's at the top because of the war and everything, but obviously it's more so like the Albereas are seen typically as the top household, but I think in general it seems like it kind of goes back and forth. It seems like there's just kind of a battle for dominancy between the 2 houses over who kind of leads the 4, you know? Then there's also the Vulcan situation, which is actually kind of sad. You know, because he had kind of like, you know, it's like, oh, he accomplished what he needed to accomplish. Because obviously you learn about his backstory a little bit more in 1 about why he hated the Chancellor, but obviously you get even more into it in 2. And, you know, even Reen, when you're on the pinnacle, kind of notices, like, he doesn't have that same fire in him. So when you face off against him, he was willing to die. Like, because he figured, like, even when he leaves, Vulcan's like, yeah, he seems like he might be the one. Like, he was already looking for a means to meet his end, and he felt like Reen might be the one who could be capable of it. And so, you know, obviously that hit Reen hard to the point like everyone else is trying to cheer him up later on, because I forgot who it was. Someone in particular was telling him it was okay to feel the way he did. Like, the fact of the matter is, it's okay for him to mourn an enemy. Some people, I can't remember who it was that was telling him that. Was kind of like saying, like, some people might look at it as a bad thing. The fact is, you're willing to mourn an enemy, but don't. That speaks volumes about you as a person. Now, the fact is that even though he was your enemy, you're still able to mourn his death, wishing that you could have done more. So, like, everyone's, you know, and because of that, Reen was inspired to, like, the next time that situation came about with Scarlet, he saved her. He wasn't going to let, you know, history repeat itself. And I even love that moment of, like, they look up and, like, it turns out Crow's there. He was like, thanks for saving her, you know? Because, you know, despite everything, they're not just like random allies. Like, he feels bad anytime any of them dies. Because obviously, you only get like background information about it. You never get to see like what exactly went down. But obviously, it's like, well, because I think it went down in Crossbell, didn't it? So you probably have to play the Crossbell games to probably get the whole Gideon thing. Because Gideon died in... The way Scarlett talks about it, she's like, it was pretty brutal, but it was like an off-screen death. But I think it might be like, if you played in particular, first Crossbell game, it'll probably like either reference or directly correlate to, like, you know, Lloyd and them crossing paths with Gideon. Because like, because I think that was at the same time as, like, wasn't that at the time of the Crossbell conference and stuff like that? At that point in time, I don't remember. A lot of that's kind of blurry together in my head. But regardless, obviously these people aren't just like, they're friends. He considers them, they're not just comrades and like, oh, they mean nothing to me. It's like, no, they're friends that mean something, because obviously they all strive for the same thing, you know? It's so interesting too, because you know, I feel like they never really went into it too much. Why Crow kept going? Because like, whereas everyone else had kind of given up, I guess for Crow, it's like, well, him and Vita had been in this together, and it's like, so she's kind of his chosen champion, which is obviously kind of a comparison to like Emma kind of stumbled across Ring. You know, she knew that there would be a potential awakener, but I don't know if she was necessarily looking out for Ring specifically. She just knew that her mission was going to take her to Thor's. So maybe it was specifically Ring she was supposed to be on the lookout for, but just because her grandmother probably made her a little more aware of like Ring's existence and stuff like that. Maybe, because even in 3, you don't really go into that too much. You just know that like her mission took her to Thor's. But regardless, you know, so it's like, it's kind of the same, but even then, like, Ring's not necessarily Emma's champion in the sense of like how Crow is to her, like to Vita, you know. But I think that's also it, because I'm sure like everything she had planned with Ouroboros, I guess Crow being her champion was connected to all of that. So it was a situation of, hey, you know, I'm through this because I owe her so much. She allowed me to get my revenge, and obviously that all played into Ouroboros' plan. So he probably felt loyalty to them. So it's like, whatever you need me to see through to the end, I'll see through to the end. Even all this stuff with the Noble Alliance and everything. So I think that's more so why, because they never really go into it too much why he kept fighting afterwards. You know, it's like, I mean, because of Cayenne, sure, but it's like he really didn't. It didn't seem like he cared too much about all of that. Like, obviously his main focus, like I said, it seems like he kind of lost his way, but not nearly as much as the others. Because whether he would have admitted it, obviously he wasn't going to go easy, but it's like he was so willing to be like, okay, if you can't beat me, you can drag me back. Like, the fact that he even put that out there shows that his heart wasn't fully in this, you know. Maybe you can make the argument it was, but I think that's why Ring came out on top, because Ring put his everything into, you know, dragging Crow back, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you know, so. Things are kind of a little depressing, so I'll kind of shift gears a little bit to kind of be on a more lighthearted thing. I meant to bring this up earlier. I thought it was kind of interesting. I didn't even talk about it at all. And one is I read the books my second time through, like all the different books and stuff like that, the Imperial Chronicles, but all the books. I made sure to read them the second time through. I'm in the process of doing that. Like, just because I don't like reading in general. Obviously, the books are short. Even just the pages themselves, they're not like longer or anything. And a lot of the stories kind of tend to be on the shorter side. But regardless, like, what I try to do is when I get the new chapters or the new Imperial Chronicles, you know, depending on the game, I try to read them then and there. That way I'm only reading one at a time and not reading them all at once. So like, for example, the first game, I read all the Red Moon Rose books, which is interesting in the grand scheme of things, because obviously like things in 3 kind of reference to those, and you're just kind of like, huh, that's interesting. Because you basically find out those books aren't 100%. I think it's in 1 as well, the Carnelia books. And I was so stupid that I forgot, because it gets brought up. I caught it the first time through, but when I was reading the books, I didn't remember this until you get to the point at the end where like, obviously the books are about Toval, but like they're partially made up, because Home Dude, who's a connected, you know, he's a connection for Sarah and Toval, the dude that works in Tristan, runs the pawn shop. He wrote those books, but it's so obvious they're alive because, oh, he wrote that he died. But part of me was thinking like, oh, the story's going to reveal that he's actually still alive and he faked his death or something, because that's why you're still alive in real life. But it was like, oh no, he kept himself dead and everything. It's like, well, he did kill himself off in the story, but also like most of it's BS. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is because Sarah references it in 2, because she's like, that's the reason why Toval became a bracer. Reference a certain, for one to know more, reference a certain book, and obviously like, Toval was kind of embarrassed, so like that's kind of a direct correlation. Like I said, they reference it a little bit in 1, but that's another reference to it in 2, those books. Like the reason, also kind of showing that the lady who inspired him. Part of me was wondering, does she have any connection to like Angelica? Because the sister Carnelia in the books, she fights with her fists and her feet, and I was wondering if that had anything to do with Angelica's master. I don't know if they ever specified what gender Angelica's master is. I don't think she's ever been like, oh, my master. She just always says my master. She never says he or she. I don't think she has ever referenced that specifically. But nevertheless, I just thought that was just kind of an interesting thing. And obviously in 2, I've read the books They're the Gambler Jack books. I thought this kind of, and this is like an interesting little detail, when you're handing the books over to the vice principal at the end, like Ring's kind of like, they were fine. He's like, preferably, I didn't like reading a book from a different, like the fact is the books take place in Calvert. He wasn't too much of a fan of that. He's like, they're fine. They were fine. Which I read those pretty quickly through, even just like, I tried to like, well, it's because you get the books at the same time throughout the game. Like, while you're getting the reprints of Gambler Jack 1, you're also getting the sequels. So I was like, bump that. I'm just going to read all of 1. And then as I get the sequels, I'll read them out. So like, you know, because obviously those stories are like, they're like what? Double-digit chapters are like, what? 14 or something like that. Maybe, I don't know. But like, they're like only like single-digit pages. Some of them are. They're actually really good stories, especially like Jack's story in 1 and 2, and just kind of like how his past kind of came back to bite him in the ass a little bit. Well, in both cases, you know. So I'm curious, well, probably not, because obviously the books in 3 are unrelated to either the Cornelia. Well, because they actually come up again in 2, actually thought about it, because you're trying to get stuff for Trista, for the shops that are selling stuff. It's basically a garage, not a garage sale, but oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, I think it's Brandon who runs the goods shop in Trista. He needs, you know, some stuff to give to the students to be able to sell. And one of the things that like Sarah, you help clean up her room, and so she gives you the Cornelia books. So that's kind of another wink and nod. Like, I just thought that was kind of interesting. You went through the trouble of collecting them in 1, and then she gives you like the whole series, mainly because she's kind of like, do whatever you want to with them. So I thought it was kind of, you know, an interesting little aspect to it. And that was just kind of flowing through my mind, because like I said, I hadn't referenced the books I read in 1, and like nor the ones I read in 2, but you know, I figured I'd go ahead and mention it all right there. There's this really interesting side quest later on in the game you get where basically, I think it might have been Rosine, because obviously at the time I think it's actually her quest that basically she's in Celtic she was in Celtic at the time everything went down. And so she wants to help out and everything. And so she wants that put on a performance. So you get Elliot, because obviously Mint's already, like, you automatically get Mint part of the crew because it's one of your first quests, you know, in the Courageous and everything. But obviously you can get Bridget, Heibel, I think is his name. He was the head of the Wind and Orchestra Club. You can get him. But obviously, like, the more people you recruit, the better. So, like, obviously you can get Instructor Mary involved, Fiona, as well as, was it Andre? Yeah, Andre, the wandering musician. He's just one of those recurring NPCs in 1 and 2 that you definitely see him just all over the place in 2. And I'll get to, like, other wandering NPCs. But it's a beautiful thing, because obviously, like, so many people got hurt. That were kind of, you know, hurt because of everything in Celtic. But obviously when you put on a performance, a lot of them end up waking up, and obviously it's just kind of like, you know, because I think there's the Luis who is the barmaid at the bar and everything, and obviously like her dad and bro live in like a farmhouse on like one of the roads, and they're over there kind of obviously because they don't know what to do without her, because she kind of handles a lot of stuff. Because I think if you go to their house at one point in time, like their dad is just feeding them raw vegetables or something like that, just because like she isn't back home, because she doesn't really come home that often because she's working in the city. And well, because the town, once again, it's one of those video game things where it's like, well, it doesn't seem like it's that long, but obviously those transitional periods, those pathways are probably a lot longer than you think they are. But it's also like, oh, this path that takes you literally a minute to go from here to here, it's like it's scaled down for the purposes of a video game. If it was realistic, it'd probably take you like a couple hours, maybe an hour or two, just walking wise, you know. Plus there's monsters on, you know, that's a whole thing as well. But regardless, yeah, I thought it was just kind of a beautiful quest, you know, just because of like all the, you know, terrible stuff. So there's a little more uplifting, you know, ness to it, you know, just because obviously at that point Celtic is still destroyed, because Celtic doesn't get fully repaired until like, I want to say, I think they reference it in the epilogue that Celtic got fully repaired, and that market is the Grand Market is kind of back in circulation again. I think if I remember correctly, I think that's kind of the one time you hear about Celtic being fully kind of back to itself, you know, because it had just kind of been, you know, a dour situation, you know, just because of everything that went down. There's actually this other interesting bonding event I'm thinking of with Milliam. I think it's maybe her second or third. It's when you're actually in Rower, that she wants to go on the train because she wants to get the bear that it was something that Osborne had gotten her, and it's kind of crazy. And even Reen's kind of like, oh, it's weird to think that Blood and Iron Chancellor would give you something like that, because even Reen, like, they'd met Osborne like on one occasion, and obviously had slightly crossed paths with him when the train was going by, and time kind of slowed down, and Reen was able to see, you know, Toa up there and Oliver and then him, but that, you know, those are the only instances. But obviously he know like how much, it's like, oh, like he must have been like a dad to you. And for Milliam, she was kind of like, well, no, I wouldn't, you know, Gramps was Gramps. So like, but even she being like, oh, sad, cry. She's like, I've never cried before. He's like, wait, you've never cried before? And I think it's beautiful because that that scene in particular, like obviously you would never get that context if you never go to that bonding event. But obviously it comes full circle at the end of the game when she breaks down crying, because she was like, and I think that's beautiful, like how that ties into Altina's story in 3. Once again, I'll kind of leave that for then, but it's just like, you know, Milliam kind of, you know, she's always got this bubbly, happily personality, and she's always got that like devilish look, like when she's cracking, you know, well, being a little sneaky and stuff like that. But she's always got such a bubbly personality, and so that whole thing about her not crying, you know, obviously it didn't sit with her, because it's like, you've never cried? What? Obviously she's got a very unique background, something else obviously you learned a little bit more about in 3, but I just thought that was such an interesting one, just because of also how it ties together at the very end of the game, about how like you know, because I think that's so beautifully done with bonding events, and I've realized that more and more with 1 and 2 and 3, going back through. I'm like, oh, like there's certain things, like if you don't go to certain people's bonding events, you won't like what's a great example? Oh, Sharon, not really avoiding it too much of as a conversation, but obviously it's the whole thing about like her being a part of Ouroboros. Like there's one thing where like Reen's asking her questions about it, and you know, obviously kind of gets a little cut off guard because he's chopping food after it gets revealed that she's it's one of the bonding events with her after it's been revealed she's part of Ouroboros, and he's chopping food and he's so distracted he ends up cutting himself. And even at one point in time, they're actually, it might be the same bonding event, it might be a different one, where she trains with him, and obviously he's so easily outclassed by her, but it is a thing of like, you know, she needs to know, he wants to know what it's like to face off against someone from Ouroboros to kind of have a better understanding of them. I mean, I already referenced it earlier, but obviously the one when you're training with Sarah and she kind of thinks to herself, you know, is kind of alluding to her like her Jaeger stuff, which obviously she ends up kind of confronting that later on when she faces off against the Northern Jaegers when you're, you know, going to arrest Eustace's dad. So there's that whole situation. I think what's actually kind of interesting too is Gaius has a very unique bonding event himself. It's one of his in Ymir's where you can actually learn this ability of his, the one where he calls Zio. Like you can learn that like, because when you get Gaius first in your party, when you're in Ymir, he's like level 70. He doesn't learn the technique until like 75 or 78. I want to say it's 75 maybe, but you can actually learn the technique a little early by going to this bonding event of his. The technique's called Hunter Wing. It's basically, obviously you go like, go Zio. I'm going to spoil it a little bit. I'm kind of bummed it didn't come back in 3. It's one of his techniques from 2 that didn't come back for 3. Granted, Zio's referenced and seen, he's just not a participant in battle. But obviously you see him from time to time, and like Gaius is by himself, like sometimes you'll find Zio there with him and Reen will kind of talk to him. I love that basically Zio is a mad shit talker, because he's like, Zio kind of does whatever he wants. He's like, yeah, I'll help you out sometime, you weaklings. It's kind of how Gaius kind of puts it. Like, yeah, he kind of actually looks down upon us. I love that being a whole thing. But it's like an ability having a storyline tied to it, like a bonding event in particular, a missable bonding event, because it doesn't matter because you can eventually get it later on anyway, but it's still just the fact of the matter is you can get it early, and that there's a kind of a story contextualized around it in that regard. I just think it's neat how the bonding events work like that, you know? Obviously, I've been running my mouth off for a long time. I'm not sure how I'm going to handle all of this, because obviously the first one I ended up kind of doing in 2 parts, but this one might end up being more. It also depends on how much of this recording I'm going to divide up, if I divide it up at all. Who knows how it's all going to look like in the final recording. But obviously I'm going to be talking more about Trails of Cold Steel 2 in the future. Most likely by the time you see this, I will most likely have already recorded the other ones as well, but we'll see in the long run. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.